Good evening. Oh, yes. Hi. I hope you don't mind if I stand. I don't really need these glasses, but I'm going to put them on anyway. I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about the Second Amendment and how it has been interpreted in terms of where we are now, and talk a little about the history of gun laws, more to make a general point about that. First, the Second Amendment, as you probably know, has been defined in law by a Supreme Court decision from 2008 called the Heller decision. And that decision established that there was a personal right of average citizens to own a handgun for personal self-protection in their home. Now, that interpretation is at odds with how the amendment had been interpreted prior to 2008, going back to when the amendment was written, modified, debated, and passed by the first Congress in 1789. But I don't want to dwell on that history unless people are interested. The Second Amendment, as you also probably know, says that a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So in the Heller decision, the Supreme Court, as I said, set out this right, but it also qualified it in a number of important ways. First, by saying that it was a qualified right, not an unlimited right. And the court specified a number of other qualifications, and I'll read them just quoting the text of the decision. The court in its majority said that the Second Amendment was not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner and for whatever purpose. That prohibitions on carrying concealed weapons would be allowable, that there could be restrictions on dangerous or unusual weapons, that felons and the mentally ill could be barred from getting weapons. It would be allowable to forbid firearms in sensitive places such as schools and government buildings, that laws regulating the storage of firearms to prevent accidents would be allowable, that there could be limitations on the commercial sale of arms, that weapons that are most useful for military service, M16 rifles and the like, may be banned. And the Second Amendment right includes a presumption of constitutionality for gun laws with some kind of historical provenance. If there was regulations that you could say were existed in prior history pretty consistently, well, that would be a presumptive basis for assuming that those laws now would probably be okay, although the court said it did not undertake its own exhaustive historical analysis to determine exactly what those laws would be. Well, others have engaged in that exhaustive historical analysis, and I have used that data quite a bit, and that takes me to the second part of what I want to talk about pertaining to the modern gun debate. And the way I introduce this is by saying that the modern gun debate is generally viewed as a zero-sum debate of gun laws versus gun rights, or gun safety versus gun rights. And that a gain for one side politically or legally is a loss for the other side, right? And vice versa. I mean, that's pretty much the framing of the gun issue in America today. But the fact is, our own gun history, gun law history, is not that at all. First, of course, guns and gun ownership are as old as the country, going back to the very first European settlers, but so are gun laws. And in fact, gun rights and gun laws were considered perfectly compatible in most of our history. So this notion of this kind of zero-sum relationship between these two opposing sides, that's a modern thing of the last few decades. And in fact, in many respects, guns were more strictly regulated in the country's first 300 years than in the last 30 years. And there is a recent compilation of early gun laws which notes and catalogs literally thousands of gun laws of every imaginable variety. I mean, there's no gun law you could think of that didn't exist at some point in our past history. In the colonies, in the states, in localities, literally from 1619, which was when the very first European colony legislative body was convened, what becomes the House of Burgesses in Virginia. They convened for the first time in 1619. Remember Jamestown settlement, 1607. They still teach that stuff, don't they? Maybe they, I don't know. Okay, maybe they don't. It's too bad if they don't. Anyway, and that very first legislature, they met in the summer of 1619 to make rules to govern the colony, because of course Britain was across the ocean and they had to have some ability to make their own laws and rules just to function on a day-to-day basis and not wait for permission from the British government, which would take months across the ocean. And among the about 35 laws they enacted in 1619 was a gun control law. And it was a law that made it a crime to give or sell or trade a gun to an Indian. And the punishment was death, if you did. And those laws were enacted prolifically in the 1600s in all of the colonies, although they had a terrible enforcement problem because you couldn't call 911 in the 1600s. Anyway, that's just one example. So what kinds of gun restrictions or gun laws existed? Well, laws obviously restricting guns from Native Americans. We were at war with Native American tribes. Slaves, not a surprise. Also indentured servants, vagrants, non-Protestants, several colonies. I mean, you can't trust a Catholic with a gun. Isn't that right? Isn't there a song like that? No, I think it's a man you can't trust with a gun. Okay, sorry. Yeah, non-Protestants. Those who refused to swear an oath of loyalty to the government, felons, foreigners, minors. There were numerous recreational restrictions going back to the 1600s. That to me was one of the most interesting things that I found among these laws. There were laws that regulated firearms use, storage, and transport, that barred dangerous or unusual weapons, that regulated the manufacture, inspection, and sale of firearms. There were gun storage and discharge restrictions. There were prohibitions regarding the firing of firearms in or near towns after dark, on Sundays, in public places, or near roads. There were punishments for those who fired their weapons indiscriminately and wasted gunpowder and shot, or those under the influence of alcohol. And there were a lot of those provisions too. One of my favorite laws was from the 1650s that made it a crime to discharge a firearm while you were drunk, but the law wrote in two exceptions, one for weddings and the other for funerals. Who thinks this up? It was like the 1650s, I don't remember which colony, but it's remarkably interesting. So the bottom line, this is kind of skipping ahead because this is just a general outline, or my bottom line is that the first gun grabbers in America were not Chablis drinking, quiche eating 1960s Ithaca liberals, excuse me, but were 17th century rum guzzling pioneers. So nothing new about gun laws. Thanks.